Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder, and each episode we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. I don't know if you can hear from my voice, but I'm not operating on peak optimal conditions. I've been struggling with a bad cold for the last about week and a half. It's one of those colds that comes in and never quite goes away. And when you talk a lot, it tickles your throat and you start hacking and coughing. It has made preaching quite interesting the last couple Sundays. And so I've been drinking lots of water and I'm drinking lots of tea as I record this podcast in order to keep my throat lubricated the best that I can and to be able to speak to you, gentle listener, without coughing and hacking. I wanted to use this opportunity about having a cold to talk a little bit about illness and pop culture. Now, when I started thinking about the role that illness plays and the role that disease plays in culture, I didn't quite realize how big of a topic it is. But it's a huge topic, especially when you start considering mental illness and addiction as illness and how culture deals with these issues. Mental illness, when it comes to video games, is especially interesting right now. It serves often as an inspiration for stories in video games. One example would be Never-Ending Nightmares, which used lead designers Matt Gilgenbach's struggles with obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression for a horror game. Or games like Depression Quest by Zoe Quinn, which uses the format of a Twine interactive novel as a way of trying to show and demonstrate what the experience of depression is like. Those are interesting topics, those are bigger topics, and at some point we'll get to them here on Geek Cross. But today I wanted to mostly talk about illness in regards to pathogens and infections and the role that plays in culture. And even then, we will only be scratching the surface today. We have it pretty good today, most of us, when it comes towards mortality. Most of us will live to an old age, and we're able to live longer in part because of diet or advances in medicine. But I think a huge part of it has to do with the fact that most forms of death now, most causes of death, are no longer external. That once upon a time in this world, most death came from external diseases and from accidents. And for the most part, we are able to control those things. That since the 1940s and the 1950s, job-related accidents have gone down by like 90%. Today, most causes of death are either natural causes or heart disease. And there's a kind of irony here. We've gone from having to worry about external deaths, killing us too young, killing us too soon, to being too fat and obese and killing ourselves by our own choices and lack of exercise and lack of an active life. And so illness continues to be something that we wrestle with in our culture. And we continue to ask questions about and deal with our anxieties in culture. My wife, Megan, is in nursing school, and she's studying to become a nurse. Actually, right now, as I'm recording this, she is in her finals of her first year of nursing school, and I have to say I'm incredibly proud. But one of the things she's had to do over the last few weeks is a group project. And the group project involves, unfortunately, looking at the film Outbreak, the Wolfgang Petersen film from 1995, which is about an outbreak of an Ebola-like virus in a California town. The film, which starts out interesting, even though it is scientifically inaccurate, quickly falls apart and degrades into a late 90s action movie about a military conspiracy, and the film ends up being less about disease and illness and pandemic and the science of combating pandemic and more of an excuse to fly around in helicopters. If you expand the scope of how culture has dealt with illness beyond action movies and geek stuff and include all of art and music, you end up with this. That was the end of the opera La Traviata by Verdi. It was recorded for a radio broadcast in December of 1946 by the NBC Symphony conducted by Artur Toscanini. It's the last 40 seconds of that opera, where the heroine, who is named Violetta, who has been dying of what they called consumption at the time, finally succumbs to her disease and sings this beautiful aria lamenting her death in the arms of her lover Alfredo. Now, we put aside the absurdity of divas singing arias while dying of what we call tuberculosis today. We can look at the cultural reasons why so many operas have so many heroines tragically dying of this disease. Consumption, or tuberculosis, goes back to antiquity. It is an illness that we have seen evidence of in the remains from Bronze Age skeletons and from Egyptian mummies. An illness that shows up over and over in culture. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, tuberculosis was associated with vampires, and it makes sense. There's a kind of logic here. When some European peasant came down with TB and died, they usually infected the rest of the family. And after death, the infected family would often slowly lose their health. And so it was believed, it was suspected, that the original family member who had died had come back, had returned as a vampire, and was gradually draining the life of the rest of the family. Back in the 19th century, when a lot of these operas were written, TB was a primary health concern. In the 1800s, it was responsible for 25% of all deaths in Europe. It was the disease of the urban poor. Baz Luhrmann, in his 2001 film Moulin Rouge, alludes to this history, this cultural history, and the reality of this disease. In his postmodern musical, at the moment of the film's climax, when the lovers have succeeded in performing the best concert ever, Satine finally succumbs to consumption and dies on stage as her lover helplessly watches. This is opera. Luhrmann uses pop songs and frenzied camera angles to essentially tell an operatic story that is filled with tragedy and is filled with emotion. In this way, Luhrmann mimics the emotional temperament of 19th century Romanticism, an artistic movement that was obsessed with breaking out of the forms of classicism, an artistic movement that embraced nature and emotions and death. So much romantic poetry is concerned with death, like William Blake's The Tiger or Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. Operas like La Traviata or La Bohème from Puccini feature heroines that succumb to illness. For the Romantics, death was not seen as the end of life, but as regeneration and transformation. The death may be the end of life as we know it, but then it was transformation to something new and something wonderful. But death for the Romantics was also frightening. And so Romanticism also often contains a lament for the end of the life we have, even though it looks forward to the new life we experience in death. It wasn't just artistic movements like Romanticism that embrace death. In the 19th century in the United States, there was a spiritualist movement where people would gather with a medium around a table and attempt to contact the dead through seances. There was a belief that death was not the end, that loved ones would remain around as ghosts, and it was possible to actually contact them and speak with them. There were even attempts from people like William James to scientifically prove the existence of an afterlife. And scholars and historians speculate that the rise of spiritualism and the occult in the United States came out of the tragedy of the Civil War, when so many Americans lost their lives. And this was a way in the 20 and 30 and 40 years after the Civil War to wrestle with and to grapple and to make sense out of all this loss. But I think the attractiveness of death as a theme in art does not just simply have to do with an artistic temperament or with philosophy or with an attempt to grapple with one's own mortality. I think stories of death can bring out emotions in us. Tragedy as a form, as an artistic form, has been around since at least the Greeks. William Shakespeare, whose plays were popular entertainment in Elizabethan England, wrote tons of tragedies like Romeo and Juliet. There's something about experiencing extreme emotion that is deeply comforting and deeply satisfying, even if it's not a happy emotion. Let me explain this in geek terms. So at the end of Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader has captured our heroes and has decided to freeze Han Solo in carbonite in order to test whether he can safely capture Luke Skywalker that way. And the side benefit, of course, of freezing Han Solo in carbonite is that you can simply and easily ship him off to Jabba the Hutt so that Boba Fett can get his bounty. And things look desperate. Things are desperate. And Han Solo and Princess Leia are standing in the chamber where Darth Vader is about to freeze our hero, and the music wells up, and Han Solo and Princess Leia kiss, and the stormtroopers yank them away, and the music swells up dramatically, and Princess Leia looks forlorn and sad and crushed and defeated into Han Solo's eyes and says, "I love you." And Han Solo says, "I know." And he's lowered into the chamber, and the music booms, and the music soars, and Princess Leia cries, and Chewbacca barks, makes noises, and the frozen slab of Han Solo comes back up and falls over with a huge thud. That is opera. Tragedy can be deeply satisfying because it allows us to go through certain emotions that otherwise would be a threat and allows us to feel them in a safe place. It's one of the same reasons why we go to horror movies, why we pay money to sit in a dark theater and have some director and some actors and some special effects scare us. And so in regards to illness, it's no surprise that right now one of the big tropes in horror movies, one of the big successful tropes in horror movies, have to do with zombies. In geekdom, zombies today are a metaphor for our collective anxieties about illness. It's a way of processing our fears about pandemics. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the modern zombie is a modern creation. That if we go back to the zombies of folklore, the zombies that we find in Haiti and in West Africa, they're not the same kind of zombies. Generally speaking, the zombies of folklore are the undead who've been put under control of a sorcerer or a wizard and who are under a spell without a will of their own. The modern concept of zombie as a metaphor for illness and pandemic largely lies with George Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead. Romero played with a stock character, the zombie. There had been zombies in films before this, and makes it something truly disturbing and truly frightening. It is thanks to Romero that we understand zombies primarily as a plague monster, and that a zombie pandemic, what we call the zombie apocalypse, means the end of the world as society collapses from this disease and illness that transfers from person to person. And so now there are films like 28 Days Later and Dawn of the Dead, the remake, Zombieland, and World War Z, TV shows like The Walking Dead, that primarily understand and treat zombies as illness. And one of the things that these shows and these films brings out, that this trope brings out, is that society, that civilization is fragile. That the things in society that we trust to give us order and stability can be quickly lost. That once this illness comes around, and people that we love and people that we know and see every day become a threat, just like in a real pandemic, society is unable to keep going. And one of the things that this trope also says is that the infected may not be the worst ones, may not be the most dangerous ones, that those who are uninfected, that the humans that are struggling and fighting for survival might be the most dangerous. That there is something about human nature that is deeply selfish and corrupt, and that if you strip away the patina of civilization, one discovers a monster or a beast willing to kill, willing to do whatever it has to in order to survive. The emergence of this trope in the modern world makes a lot of sense, because we are afraid of pandemics. These kinds of illnesses, these kinds of diseases threaten to destroy our way of life, that threaten to kill us, are one of the few things that we cannot control in this world, that are unknowns. It is one of the things that seems to be, that could get out of control. We saw this kind of fear during the Ebola outbreak of last year, that mostly happened in West Africa, in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and in Guinea. It's been a horrible situation in that part of the world. It has brought these countries to a standstill. And yet, there's been so much fear in the West, so much fear in America, that somehow Ebola would get past the health officials, would come here to the United States, and all of a sudden we would experience this pandemic and collapse of society. As of April the 25th, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 26,194 suspected cases and 10,857 deaths. Most of these deaths, pretty much all of these deaths, are in West Africa. In the U.S., there were 4 reported cases, 4, and no deaths. But you wouldn't have known that from the news. You wouldn't have known that from the constant fear-mongering and the constant focus of Ebola. That Ebola could come here and kill all of us and destroy us. One of the things that I heard as a pastor that I felt was completely offensive was that the Ebola outbreak happened around the time that we had a crisis at the U.S. border, where a lot of children from Latin and South America had just shown up, and the government didn't know what to do with the thousands and thousands of children and how to process them, whether or not to send them back home, whether to bring them into the country. And there was this crisis. And one of the things that I heard that I thought was incredibly and deeply offensive was the suggestion, was the fear that these children from Latin and South America would bring Ebola into the United States. There was pretty much no chance of that happening because these children did not come from a region that was impacted by Ebola. But it speaks to the gross inequalities of the world. Those who mostly will suffer from pandemic and from illness are not the ones who live in wealthy nations where we have access to a good healthcare infrastructure and experimental medicines, and we have resources, we have monies. The rich will survive. It is those who live in poor countries, those who live in the global south who do not have that infrastructure who will suffer. It is West Africa that suffers from Ebola, not in the West. Now, the Bible deals a lot with illness, and there are a number of passages where people are inflicted with physical illness. In the book of Exodus, there is this contest between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt over the question of whether or not the Pharaoh is going to release the Hebrew slaves out of slavery. And as part of this contest, there are 10 plagues. They include things like locusts and frogs and water turned into blood. But 2 of the plagues are also diseases. One is a disease that kills all of the Egyptian livestock, and another disease is where the Egyptians have boils on their arms. And this contest is to prove the supremacy of the Hebrew God over the Egyptian gods, and it's also a form of God's judgment. The book of Revelation, of course, has the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and one of these is understood to be pestilence. That the world suffers pestilence as part of God's judgment at the end of days. But in the Bible, illness can also be a metaphor for spiritual healing. In 2 Kings chapter 5, the commander of the Syrian military, who is named Naaman, comes to Jerusalem seeking the prophet Elisha to find a cure for a skin disease that he's suffering from. Now, Naaman expects some sort of ritualistic, impressive magic. But Elisha refuses to perform a miracle. Instead, he tells Naaman to go out and bathe himself 7 times in the river Jordan. And Naaman is so offended by this that he storms out of the temple, he gets into his chariot, they leave Jerusalem, and as they pass the river Jordan, he basically decides, what the heck, let me give this a shot. And so Naaman gets out of his chariot, gets into the river Jordan, and he bathes himself, he washes himself 7 times. And miraculously, he is healed of his disease. And Naaman, of course, is so thrilled by this development that he rushes back to Elisha and he offers expensive gifts, which Elisha refuses. And so Naaman rejects his old Syrian god, and accepts Yahweh as the one true God and converts to the Hebrew God. Like the story in Exodus, this is another story in the Old Testament that shows the supremacy of Yahweh, of the Hebrew God, over other competing gods in the region. Now, Jesus in the New Testament also does a lot of healing. He heals a lot of lepers, and certainly these examples of healing are an indicator, are sign of Jesus' divinity. But it's not only that. Jesus' healing is a sign of the kingdom of God that he has been declaring, of a new relationship between God and humanity, where people are made whole, where the relationship has been restored. And there are different signs of that in the New Testament. One sign of this new kingdom is when Jesus eats with tax collectors and prostitutes. Another sign of the kingdom is when Jesus performs miracles, like feeding the crowd of 5,000 with a few loaves and fish. And one of these signs of this new kingdom is when Jesus heals the sick and the ill. There are 2 particular stories that I want to talk about in this episode. The first one is in John 9, when Jesus heals a blind man who has been blind since birth. And the disciples and Jesus have this conversation. The disciples ask, why is this man blind? Is he blind because of his own sin? Or is he blind because of his parents' sin? There is in the first century a belief, not only in Hebrew culture, but in many other cultures, that illness is this punishment from God. That the reason why people suffer, the reason why people are disabled, is because somebody has committed a sin that they have not repented from. And so the effects of that sin grow and grow and grow, and they manifest themselves in physical ways. And Jesus says, no, none of that is true. This man is not blind because of sin. However, through this blind man, we're going to see God at work. And Jesus comes up to the blind man, he spits in the ground, he takes the mud, he rubs it in the guy's eyes, and the man can see. And so after the man sees again, he goes to the temple, he goes to the Pharisees. And it is the job of the religious authorities, when it comes to illness, when it comes to disease, and when it comes to disabilities, to declare that someone has been healed, that they're now safe to be in society. A lot of this has to do with ritual cleanliness and purity. And so the blind man comes to the Pharisees and says, look what has happened to me. And instead of the religious authorities gathering around him and saying, oh my goodness, that's amazing, they greet him with suspicion. They first doubt whether or not the man had really actually been blind. And so they call up his parents, and his parents says, no, that's our son. And yes, he has been blind. He was blind his entire life. And then the real issue emerges. Jesus healed this man on the Sabbath. And according to the Torah, according to religious law, no work is supposed to be done on the Sabbath. That includes healing. And so the Pharisees say, Jesus could not have healed this man. Jesus could not have given sight to this man because it's the Sabbath. And we know the law of Moses. We know you're not supposed to work. We know you're not supposed to do these things. And so Jesus cannot heal this man because he must be a sinner. And they end up chasing this man, this healed man, out of the temple. The other story of healing in the New Testament I want to talk about involves a woman that encounters Jesus. And it's a story that shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what the Gospels say is that this woman had been bleeding for 12 years, that she was suffering from an affliction where she bled constantly. And according to Leviticus, according to the law, this woman was untouchable. That when a woman is menstruating, she cannot be touched until she cleanses herself ritually. And so this woman has gone for over a decade as an outsider, as a marginal person who has not been touched in this entire time. And so she seeks out Jesus for healing, but perhaps because of her experiences, she is so afraid of what might happen that instead of talking to Jesus directly, she hides in the crowd, and as Jesus comes by, she reaches out and she touches the hem of his garment, the edge of his robe, and is instantly healed from her affliction. And Jesus, of course, feels that kind of power going through him, the healing power, and he turns around and asks, "Who did that?" And the woman comes clean and confesses that she is the one who was bold enough to reach out and touch him. Both of these stories of healing are about the radical inclusion of the kingdom of God. That those people who have been condemned, that those people who have been put to the side, are to be included in this new kingdom, in this new relationship. And that through Jesus Christ, God brings healing and wholeness to brokenness. And so the question of illness in the Bible is not just simply about physical affliction. It is about something that is larger and greater. And in the midst of that, God brings hope. In the midst of that, Jesus brings hope. And it is a hope that defies expectations, as people that we would not expect are included in this kingdom. If you like Geek Cross, please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can find Geek Cross on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. Our email is geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Geek Cross is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy. Thank you for listening.